have won their 6th NBA championship, and it's their second three-peat.
It's pretty great that a guy won 3 titles, left for 2 years, came back and won 3 more. That is considered greatness to me.
Yeah.
Winning ultimately decides who the greatest players are in the game.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the episode of Just Say Guay. I'm your host, George Guay. Today, I'm joined by Roland Lazenby, who is the author of many books, including Michael Jordan, The Life, and I think it would be appropriate to have him on, given what's been going on with the ESPN special of Michael Jordan's career with the Bulls. So, Roland, thanks for coming on.
Sure, George. Happy to do it.
So before we get going on the questions, could you just introduce yourself, maybe provide a little background information on yourself?
Yes, my name's Roland Lazenby. I've been writing about basketball for just shy of 40 years. I've written a fair amount of college basketball, much of that in the actually in the 80s. And then toward about 87, I started writing about the NBA. And I started first with the Celtics. I also did projects with I write a lot of books, projects with the Pistons and the Lakers, and later stuff with the Atlanta Hawks, Phoenix Suns. I've edited Lindy's Pro Basketball Annual for 25 years, I think. I wrote the history of the NBA Finals, the official history, back in 1990, which allowed me to interview all the old-timers and everybody who'd ever won championships, guys like George Mikan, all the old owners, a lot of different people. And so I love to do interviews. I've also taught college journalism for 21 years, 10 of it at Virginia Tech. I no longer teach.
Okay, that's a very impressive background. Very well-known people in those books that you've written about, and especially Michael Jordan as well. So take us into the Life of Michael Jordan book. A lot of authors, when they write about athletes, they really just show what happened in their career from start to finish. You go very far back in the start of Michael Jordan's life, growing up in Wilmington, North Carolina. Why did you do that instead of just showing when he got picked by the Bulls?
Well, these guys playing basketball at this high level, these ultimate stars, I guess we'll call them, they are not just athletes, they are global cultural figures. My Jordan book, published by Little Brown, is also in 15 different languages with other publishers around the globe. I wrote a biography of Kobe Bryant in 2016. That's in like 12 languages around the globe. And so these are cultural figures. I did a book on Jerry West, the great Lakers star who became an executive with the Lakers. And I did that for ESPN Books back in 2010. And I went back 400 years on his life. His family began as the colonial governors of Virginia, one of them, and Lord Thomas West, Lord De La Warr. And so Delaware, the Delaware River, the Delaware Indians, all named after how many greats grandfather. Now, Jerry's branch of the family, one of the sons got kicked out of the family and out of the will, and they went over to West Virginia, became dirt-scratching hillbillies. And my old man was a two-handed set shooter out of the hills of southern West Virginia back in the 30s. And so I guess my father died of brain cancer in 81, and it was a tough time. I was a news reporter at the time. I worked nights. I'd have to go over after I got off about 1, and I'd sit up with him a good bit. But, I played a little bit of college football. I'd always played pickup basketball. But as my father went through this difficult time and then passed, I began playing pickup basketball again religiously because it made me feel close to him. And then while I was working full-time as a newspaper reporter, I went to grad school in a writing program at Hollins University here in Virginia. And I started writing a basketball book. And, it really wasn't until I wrote Michael Jordan, The Life. I've written 70-some books. Just about all of them about basketball. Not all of them, but just about. I realized, there's this strange pull that Michael's father had on him that drove much of his ferocity and he was always really sort of, don't get me wrong, he loved his father dearly, but his father disapproved of him when he was young. And Michael was always winning the argument, always yelling at the old man across time. And it's funny how when you do projects like this, you start to understand more of your own life. I know this is a long answer to your question, okay, but these are cultural stories. And they don't happen in a vacuum, the short answer. And so many I'm writing Magic Johnson now, and I'm back in the brutal caste system that blacks faced in Mississippi, and a similar caste system in North Carolina, where his parents came from. And so these are Black Power stories. They're not the Black Power of Huey Newton or the Black Panthers. It's a Black economic power, a different sort of power that really comes from all the struggles in the age of sharecropping in this country.
Okay, so you mentioned how Michael's father really disapproved of him, kind of had a tough relationship with him, but in the long run, maybe he was trying to push him and fuel that fire in him. Do you think that the relationship that Michael had with his parents, do you think it made him more coachable?
Oh, I think obviously parents make a great deal of difference. That's the other reason I go back and tell these stories. I'm writing about Magic Johnson, just an unbelievable world-class set of parents. Now, I think the disapproval of James Jordan for his son was real. It wasn't long before Michael was capturing his father's heart. That doesn't stop that other conversation, though. It is hardwiring a lot of times in young people. They're always answering their parents, whatever disapproval they feel. Sometimes they're not aware of it. As I said, I was aware that writing about basketball, and I played pickup basketball for years, made me feel closer to my father. I also, though, was answering a good bit of his disapproval of me.
Yeah, so I think that's a great answer, and it's really been shown in not just your book, but also the ESPN film series. So other than winning championships in the 90s, the Bulls were really such an iconic team off the court. You mentioned in your book that they produced or earned 40% of all merchandise sales of basketball apparel in general. For someone like myself who didn't grow up watching the Bulls, how can you describe how big of an icon that team was as a whole? I mean, whether it's characters like Phil Jackson with running the triangle offense, Dennis Rodman, who left the team to go on vacation, Michael's killer will, or even Scotty, who had to put up with the fact that he was so underpaid. How do they make them all come together and make such a big icon of themselves?
Well, American basketball really struggled. In the early days, the NBA essentially started right after World War II, the 46-47 season. They had a lot of different franchises start up and fold. The only way they were really making any money is to have doubleheaders with the Harlem Globetrotters, who were a fantastic team out of Chicago that could play straight ball or could play all their comedy stuff. The fans loved the Globetrotters. A lot of times the NBA teams would come out and some of the fans weren't going to hang around. They'd already gotten the show. And so the NBA came along and got better and, of course, integrated eventually. They didn't want to let the Globetrotters in the league. That was always a battle. But, they got along. Magic Johnson, Larry Bird obviously had some charisma that generated the largest ever audience for the NCAA championship in 1979. And they took their rivalry into the NBA, and that was good. But Michael Jordan made it a global thing, and nobody cared about American basketball. And suddenly, Jordan, with his style, his ability to leap, to fly, and then his competitive ferocity. I mean, the guy's a maniac. And he drives everybody around him, drives himself, puts all this pressure on everybody. But everywhere around the globe, the NBA was also making a big effort to create a global product. David Stern became commissioner in '84, and the NBA began dumping basketball games into other countries. In Romania, where they love soccer, they couldn't even afford to produce their own soccer games. But suddenly they were looking at MJ, and this was going on all over the place. People were getting excited. And the NBA, because of all this exposure, making their games dirt cheap for television broadcasts, suddenly they were selling all of this equipment, all these T-shirts. It went from a few hundred million to a couple billion a year very quickly in foreign revenues. And so Jordan, once he got paired with Nike, on that big stage with all that advertising, with all the stuff he could do, and the Gatorade commercial, he was the godhead of this suddenly soaring sports merchandising industry. He was this central figure that really could sell about anything.
He was bigger than the Pope, they said in France.
Yeah. And just the way he played was, and what people are seeing with the Last Dance series now is just how ferocious he was and how he played. There have been great players, but no one had ever quite been that crazy.
Yeah, so one of the things I noticed in your book was that how Michael Jordan always talked about how he wants the team to succeed and he will make the sacrifices. It's holding everybody accountable, being the first one in the gym, all that kind of stuff that good teammates do. But he very stressed that he wanted to be the reason why they won. How do you think he was able to balance that? Because I don't think many stars can do that today because they can get so self-absorbed in themselves or maybe be a bit unselfish. How do you think he made that work?
I think Michael's plenty selfish. And I think that a couple of things. Anthony Tichy, who played at Wake Forest, I interviewed him back when I was writing the book, and he said, I don't think Michael Jordan has ever gotten credit for having the willingness to go play for Dean Smith, because that was all team basketball. It was a very tight system at Carolina. And Tex Winter, my dear friend, who was the triangle coach for the Bulls, said the thing that made Michael Jordan was his willingness to do that at North Carolina. When he got to the NBA, he was unleashed from all of that, and he went through all of those early seasons, different coaches. It was a feast. He was running up and down the floor, dunking on everybody, humiliating people. Nobody wanted to get stuck on one of his posters, and it was happening every night. It was crazy. But, he faced a very difficult team in the Detroit Pistons. And the Pistons just beat the crap out of him. They were a very physical team. I used to do a lot of work with the Pistons, and so those guys were tough guys. They were the bad boys. And Jordan came to realize, Jerry Krause, the guy he battled with so much, had always envisioned Tex Winter being a coach for his team. And the first thing Krause did was hire Tex Winter, the triangle coach. But none of the coaches that were with the Bulls wanted to run the triangle. It was an old college offense. It was viewed as kind of stilted. But Tex was the offensive genius of it. And at one point, Doug Collins, as you saw on the show, blocked Tex from practice and all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. But Phil Jackson was hired. Nobody wanted Phil as a coach, but Krause wanted him because Krause had scouted him in college at the University of North Dakota. thought he was just a really bright guy and wanted to draft him for the Baltimore Bullets. But the Knicks got Phil first. But Phil had a bad reputation. He'd written that book for Playboy Press about winning the 73 championship with the Knicks and then doing LSD on the beaches in L.A. and running wild, and he wasn't really viewed as a top option. Krause brought him in for an interview, and Stan Albeck, the coach of the Bulls, said, "There's no way I want to hire that guy." And so Krause got rid of Stan Albeck, hired Doug Collins, and Doug Collins, as he admitted in the series, when he saw Phil there, he knew that that was sort of his replacement. Sure enough, they went to the Eastern Conference Finals, and Doug got fired. And here comes Phil. And Phil's great job was, and it took a long time, it was like bass fishing with a plastic worm. I mean, you got to have incredible patience to put that plastic worm down there and let that bass take his mind. And this went on forever. But they got Michael. Michael had won every individual honor there was, and they got him to the point where he was willing to start sharing with lesser teammates and to not make it so much about his individual prowess, because he really wanted to win. And that part of the story, it's one of the classic stories in all of sports about merging. Tex used to tell him, there is no I in team. And Michael would always go back at Tex Winter and say, yeah, but there's an I in win. And so merging this masterful individual player, getting him to remember his team roots, and then to build, the triangle is what they call a two-guard front. Most basketball is a one-guard front, the point guard out front. But with the two-guard front, they initiate the pass to the guy on the side, the wing, and one of the guards cuts through to the corner. And that's called filling the corner, and that creates an off-balance court. And Michael, meanwhile, is on the other side, often the weak side. So 60% of the defense is across the court from him, away from him. And so it's very hard, and it was very hard to double-team Michael. He could feast. And Kobe Bryant did the same thing later for the Lakers. They'd get on the backside of the defense and be able to attack. And those two guys are very similar in their ability to attack the basket and score lots of points.
That's a great answer. So you mentioned that Phil Jackson was brought in by Jerry Krause to run the triangle offense, and there's no denying closer towards the end, their relationship was gone. And one thing I admire about this Bulls team is that Michael's bad relationship with the GM, Phil knows he's on his way out. Even if he wins 82 games in a row, they said, Scottie Pippen's right to get paid. How were they able to make that work? Because, you saw LeBron in his early years with Cleveland. Once the relationship with the owner went, he was gone. And even with my Patriots this year, you saw Tom Brady and Bill Belichick. If it didn't work with the quarterback and the coach, they weren't going back to the Super Bowl. How do you think that even they were able to make that work and put everything aside?
Actually, I did a book on that season called Blood on the Horns, and I was there throughout the whole thing. And Chicago Tribune listed it as a literary companion to the Last Dance, the documentary. That came out in '98, a couple of months after the season. This had been building like gas in a mine. I actually was writing a history of the Bulls in '94 when, in doing the interviews with Krause and Phil, I suddenly realized these two guys hate each other. Nobody knew that, but they had worked together for a number of years. Krause was the kingmaker, but they started fighting over money because Phil wanted to be paid like a championship coach. And he had an agent. Krause was furious. Of course, today every coach has an agent. It's ridiculous, but they got into this fight. It got personal. All the players were angry with Krause for one reason or another. He was a very brusque man. He was a genius in what he envisioned. He was a short little fat guy who got bullied a lot, backup catcher on the baseball team. He would catch pitches for warm-up. He had been the GM of the Bulls back in the mid-'70s and had screwed up and got fired in 3 months. He was a great baseball scout, a great basketball scout. And when he had done some baseball scouting for Jerry Reinsdorf, and he gave Krause a chance to pick his job. He said Jerry Reinsdorf had just picked up the Bulls for $10 million. It was a joke. It was a terrible franchise. They wouldn't even take away the hockey plexiglass when they had Bulls games. Fans had to watch the Bulls through the plexiglass.
I didn't know that.
It just was not a good franchise. But Michael turned it into all this money. Reinsdorf wasn't eager to pay Pippen or Jackson, and it didn't appear. He when he gave Michael the $30 million, he gave him a year after Michael being unpaid forever. He told Michael he would grow to resent it, and that just infuriated Michael. You know, part of the conclusion of Blood on the Horns is they all shared a big role in this. What we haven't seen, and I don't know if we will see this because this is a series controlled by Michael Jordan. He sat on this footage for 20 years. This has been Klay Thompson's uncle, Andy Thompson, was the field producer that shot all this beautiful footage behind the scenes of the 98 season. Mm-hmm. He's mentioned in a little tagline there. But when I was there, Andy was, he was the man. He was getting behind the scenes. He talked to everybody there, talked to me, just hundreds and hundreds of hours of film, and it sat there for 20 years until Michael agreed to release it. Now, I sat down with Michael in 2008. I'll make this point. I was talking with him. Kobe was becoming MVP, and he and Kobe had this mutual admiration society, and we were talking about Kobe, and it was obvious how much Michael thought of Kobe and all the work he had put into the game. And I also began talking with Michael about his own life. And one of the first things he said about his own life is timing is everything. And, of course, he's the guy with perfect timing. He comes along and becomes the godhead of this sports merchandising empire. At the time that suddenly they're advertising him like no other athlete, at the time that the NBA is stuffing all these games around the globe, and the whole thing blows up, and he has the ferocity and the presence and the charisma to drive it all. And now here we are, all these years later, he has held off on allowing this footage to come forward in a documentary. And we're in the time of the 19, of the COVID, and everybody's sort of hiding in their abodes, and the only thing available is Michael Jordan's perfect timing. His documentary is coming out there, No Sports. We're all thinking and talking and witnessing really for the first time just how ferocious he was.
Yeah, one of the things I love about the documentaries is, I've always considered Michael Jordan to be the greatest. I mean, when I think of basketball, he always comes to mind. And I think it's really educating a lot of the people my age who never really got to see him. So my next question is, a lot of people when they defend Michael Jordan, they mentioned the 6 rings, 6-0 in the finals, 6 finals MVPs. What else do you think that makes him reach that level of that he's the standard?
The competitive integrity. I have to say, I wrote 700 pages on him without calling him the greatest. To me, that I'm a writer, but that's not my job to declare one. I mean, am I going to insult Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who piled up everything? He wasn't the most. I mean, that skyhook was gorgeous, but Kareem was a surly guy. Am I going to disrespect Bill Russell or Kobe Bryant or LeBron James? I just take the attitude, each of these guys, they spent years and years and years playing this game all out, night after night after night after night, each of them making their own statement about their own individual greatness. I'm not going to sit here in some chair and try to put a score on that. That each of them has made a statement, a competitive statement. And I just treasure all of them for that. I just don't want to shortchange or disrespect that. And Michael is fabulous. You can see it. You can see all of his charisma right now. He can do things LeBron James could never do. Guess what? LeBron James can do plenty that Michael could never do. They're very different players and very different leaders. But in their own times, games are very different now. the basketball of today is nothing like the basketball back then, and vice versa. And so I think it's too hard to intelligently really make that decision. I appreciate Michael. You know, I wrote a 600-page book on Kobe Bryant. I wrote 2 books on Kobe, one when he was young, spent a lot of time with him. Then in 2016, I did Showboat, The Life of Kobe Bryant. And I have tremendous respect for what Kobe accomplished and how Jerry Sloan, I'll leave you with this, unless you have another question. Jerry Sloan, the great coach of the Utah Jazz, who was Mr. Chicago Bull before Michael Jordan ever was. He was this tough guy out of Illinois off a farm. You know, he had hands the size of like basketballs. And he was just out there battling every night. So there weren't huge crowds always in Chicago, but they worshiped that guy. And when he coached Karl Malone and John Stockton, he let them know his credo. He says, basketball is a simple game if you lay your heart on the floor every single night. And he did it. And these guys that we're talking about, these all-time greats, they got there by laying their heart on that floor. And so I just have too much respect for that to try to say, oh, he's number 5 and he's number 2. To me, that's just subjective, and it makes no difference what I think. And I've written lots of books about it. What matters is what they did.
I think that's a phenomenal answer, and an answer I've never really heard, especially someone who's like to debate sports all the time. So my last question, you know, you mentioned you've written about Kobe Bryant. Recently, he tragically passed away. He was the first basketball jersey I've ever owned. You know, I got one a few years back that fit me now. I even wore it 3 days in a row after he passed away. It was just probably the most iconic figure to me. You know, he, like many players have said, he's my Michael Jordan. You mentioned their great relationship. Is there a story that you have about the two of them that, you know, you could share? Because, you know, we really just saw it mostly when they played against each other, whether it's that first All-Star game or, you know, when Michael was on the Wizards and he was handing the torch.
I was there for all of those. Back in the old days, a scavenger like me could go to the NBA All-Star game with my press credential and go anywhere. And the night Kobe was a rookie and won the slam dunk contest, he and I sat in the locker room talking for 30, 45 minutes before he went out there and put on that great show. You know, it was just that kind of thing. And I spent a lot of time with Kobe. I really admired his work ethic. He was a lost and lonely kid. But I will tell you this, after I visited with Michael in 2008, and Michael was telling me Kobe's the guy who's done the work, and it was obvious Michael, not just with what he said, but how he said it, he had all this respect for Kobe. So the Lakers were in the playoffs, and I went out there right after talking to Michael, and I was sitting in the Laker locker room before the game talking to somebody, and Kobe was across the way lacing up his sneakers. And I said, Kobe, I just talked to Michael. He had some things to say about you. And Kobe lit up like an 8-year-old kid. He went, really? Well, what did he say? You know, it was comical the way he did it. But it just struck me, you know, they played for the same coaches. I introduced Kobe to Tex Winter. Tex Winter became Kobe's Yoda. I introduced Kobe to George Mumford, who was the mindfulness expert and psychologist who worked with the Bulls and then worked with the Lakers. And George Mumford became one of the most important people in Kobe's life. And I think of the great joy and the great pain that both marked Kobe's life. He had a horrible adjustment as one of the NBA. I often equated it to I had to do a speech. I was talking about Kobe Bryant to a high school auditorium, I don't know, 10 years ago more. And they were asking me what Kobe was like. And there was this young lady, a senior on the front row. I said, do you have a job? She says, yeah, I work at the grocery store. I said, okay, go into the grocery store this afternoon as a 17-year-old. Tell all the adults who've been working there for years that in another 6 years, you're going to own the grocery chain. that you are going to be the greatest grocery employee in history, and that you want all of them to stay after work today to work on their checkout skills and to work on their stocking skills so that they can be great with you. I said, now, how do you think your older employees are going to respond to that? She said, not very well at all. And Derek Fisher told me once, you know, that was the way we all should have been. You know, if we were all like Kobe Bryant, I mean, he was a tough guy. He was another really harsh person at times, cold, hard to be, his teammate a lot. But if we all had that drive, we'd probably be building condos on the moon at the very moment.
Well, I appreciate that answer, especially for someone like me who's a Kobe fan. But I appreciate you for coming on. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks a lot.